Imagine finding a photograph so radiantly joyful that it could lift the spirits of even the most melancholy soul. A portrait that captured childhood happiness so perfectly that viewers found themselves smiling involuntarily, their hearts lightened by the pure innocence captured within the frame. For 2 years, such an image graced the homes and hearts of families across New England, becoming a symbol of hope and unburdened youth. But what happens when the source of such perfect joy conceals a darkness so profound that learning the truth transforms light into shadow, laughter into screams? This is the story of how a single child's secret shattered the illusion of the most beloved photograph of the 1890s, revealing that sometimes the brightest smiles hide the deepest horrors. The year was 1897, and in the prosperous mill town of Havenport, Connecticut, photography had become the favored method for wealthy families to document their prosperity and happiness. The Victorian era's emphasis on childhood innocence and family virtue found perfect expression in the carefully composed portraits that adorned the parlors of the social elite. Nowhere was this art form more perfectly executed than in the studio of Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, New England's most celebrated photographer of children. Mrs. Ashford had built her reputation on an almost supernatural ability to capture the essence of childhood joy. Where other photographers struggled to keep restless children still long enough for proper exposure, she seemed to possess an innate understanding of how to make young subjects genuinely happy during their sessions. Her portraits didn't show children merely posing. They radiated authentic delight, as if she had captured them in moments of pure, unguarded bliss. Her studio occupied a converted carriage house behind the Ashford family mansion on Elm Street. Its interior painted in cheerful yellows and whites, with large windows that flooded the space with warm golden light. The walls displayed her finest works, dozens of portraits of children at play, children laughing, children caught in moments of innocent wonder. But among all these celebrated images, one photograph held a position of special reverence on the mantelpiece of the studio's main room. The portrait showed a girl of perhaps 8 years old, with golden curls that caught the light like spun silk, and eyes that sparkled with an inner radiance that seemed almost supernatural. She wore a white dress trimmed with delicate blue ribbons, and her small hands clutched a porcelain doll dressed in identical clothing. But it was her smile that made the portrait truly extraordinary, an expression of such pure, unbounded joy that it seemed to illuminate the entire photograph from within. The child's face radiated happiness so complete and genuine that viewers found it impossible to look upon the image without feeling their own spirits lifted. Her laughter seemed frozen at the moment of its most perfect expression, her eyes crinkled with mirth, her entire being seeming to vibrate with the kind of innocent delight that adults spend their lives trying to recapture. What made this portrait so remarkable was not just its technical perfection, but the profound emotional response it evoked in everyone who saw it. From the moment Mrs. Ashford first displayed it in her studio in the spring of 1897, visitors were invariably transformed by the child's joyous presence. Business meetings became more pleasant when conducted in the studio's cheerful atmosphere. Mothers brought their melancholy children to see the portrait, believing that exposure to such perfect happiness might cure their own offspring's doldrums. "She's like a little angel of joy," remarked Mrs. Penelope Whitmore during her first visit to commission a portrait of her twin sons. Looking at her face, one can almost hear her laughter echoing through the room. There's something almost magical about the way she radiates pure happiness. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a respected physician who had grown cynical about human nature through years of treating the town's ailments, found himself equally moved by the image. In 20 years of medical practice, I have seen countless expressions of human emotion, but I have never encountered joy so pure and unmarred by the complexities of adult understanding. This child seems to exist in a state of perfect innocence. Word of the extraordinary portrait spread quickly through Havenport's interconnected social circles. Soon, people were visiting Mrs. Ashford's studio not to commission their own photographs, but simply to experience the uplifting effect of the joyful child's presence. They came individually and in groups, speaking in hushed, reverent tones as if they were witnessing something sacred. The child's identity became a source of gentle curiosity among the townspeople. Surely someone so radiant, so perfectly happy, must be known to someone in their community. But when questioned, Mrs. Ashford would only smile mysteriously and refer to the portrait as Little Lily's picture, offering no surname or family connections. This air of mystery only added to the image's allure. allowing viewers to project their own hopes for childhood happiness onto the unnamed subject. As months passed, the demand for copies of the portrait grew overwhelming. Families throughout New England requested prints for their own homes, believing that the child's joyous presence would bring harmony and happiness to their households. Mrs. Ashford found herself working from dawn to dusk in her darkroom, carefully crafting prints from the original glass plate negative. Each copy required painstaking attention to ensure that the luminous quality of the child's smile and the intricate details of her dress and doll were perfectly reproduced. Mr. Jonathan Hartwell, president of the First National Bank of Havenport, hung his copy in the bank's main lobby, where it became a source of comment and conversation among customers. "It transforms the entire atmosphere of our establishment," he told the local newspaper. "Customers seem more patient, more pleasant in their dealings when they're in the presence of such innocent joy. I swear the child's happiness is contagious." Young mothers began requesting copies for their children's nurseries, convinced that exposure to such perfect joy would encourage their own little ones to develop similarly sunny dispositions. The Reverend Samuel Blackwood acquired a print for the Sunday school classroom at First Congregational Church, where it hung beside biblical illustrations of children coming unto Jesus. Even the town school board voted to purchase a copy for display in the main hallway of the elementary school, believing that students would benefit from daily exposure to such a perfect example of childhood contentment. Teachers reported that children seemed more cheerful and cooperative when passing the portrait, often stopping to smile back at the joyful little girl who seemed to welcome them to their studies. The portrait's influence extended far beyond mere decoration. People reported that contemplating the image during times of stress or sadness brought them genuine comfort. Grieving parents found solace in the child's radiant happiness during their darkest hours. Business owners claimed that having the portrait in their establishments created a more positive atmosphere that improved customer relations. Students preparing for examinations swore that studying in the presence of the image improved their concentration and reduced their anxiety. As 1897 progressed into 1898, the portrait had become something approaching a cultural phenomenon. Art critics from Boston and New York traveled to Havenport specifically to study Mrs. Ashford's masterpiece. Professor Helena Whitman from Vassar College's Department of Fine Arts wrote extensively about what she called the transcendent quality of innocent joy, using Mrs. Ashford's work as the prime example of photography's potential to capture not just physical appearance, but the pure essence of human emotion. This single image, Professor Whitman declared in her influential essay published in Harper's Magazine, represents the pinnacle of child portraiture. The subject's expression suggests a level of untainted happiness that philosophers and poets have spent centuries trying to describe. In capturing this moment of perfect joy, Mrs. Ashford has given us a glimpse of what childhood might be before the world's troubles touch it. The portrait's fame spread far beyond New England's borders. Photography societies in major cities requested copies for their exhibitions. European collectors began making inquiries about acquiring prints. Mrs. Ashford found herself fielding correspondence from as far away as California and even London, all seeking copies of what had become known throughout the artistic community as the Angel of Joy. But as the portrait's reputation grew, so too did the pressure on Mrs. Ashford to reveal more about its origins. Journalists began making pilgrimages to her studio, hoping to uncover the story behind the image that had captured the imagination of an entire region. Art collectors offered substantial sums, not just for prints, but for information about the subject. Who was this little Lily? What family could claim such a perfectly happy child? What was the source of the unbounded joy that seemed to radiate from her very being? Mrs. Ashford's responses to these inquiries became increasingly evasive. Where once she had simply deflected questions with vague references to client confidentiality, she now seemed genuinely distressed when pressed for details. Visitors noticed that she would often glance nervously at the portrait while discussing it, as if seeing something in the image that others could not perceive. Her hands would tremble slightly when handling the original glass plate negative, and she began to insist on personally overseeing every aspect of the printing process, allowing no assistants to touch the precious original. Mrs. Whitmore, who had become one of the portrait's most devoted admirers, began to notice subtle changes in Mrs. Ashford's demeanor during her regular visits to the studio. The photographer, who had once taken evident pride in her masterpiece, now seemed almost haunted by it. She would stare at the image for long periods, her face cycling through expressions that seemed to war between joy and something approaching dread. "Sometimes I wonder," Mrs. Ashford confided to Mrs. Whitmore during one particularly unsettling visit, "whether we truly understand the power of happiness when it appears in its purest form. This portrait has brought so much joy to so many people, but I sometimes feel as though I've captured something that was never meant to be preserved, never meant to be shared so widely." The comment struck Mrs. Whitmore as odd, but she attributed it to the artistic temperament that often afflicted creative individuals. Surely Mrs. Ashford was simply experiencing the complex emotions that came with creating something so universally beloved. It was natural, she reasoned, for an artist to feel both pride and anxiety when her work achieved such widespread acclaim. As 1898 progressed, the portrait continued to bring joy and comfort to the hundreds of families who had acquired copies. Children grew up under the gentle, smiling gaze of little Lily. Couples began their marriages with her blessing hanging in their homes. The elderly found solace in her presence during their twilight years. The image had become woven into the fabric of New England society, a constant source of light and happiness in an often harsh and unforgiving world. But beneath this surface of universal admiration, something was beginning to change in Mrs. Cordelia Ashford. Those who knew her well noticed that she had grown increasingly reclusive, spending more and more time alone in her studio with the original portrait. Her other work began to suffer as she became obsessed with studying every detail of her masterpiece, examining it under magnifying glasses with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Her notebook entries from this period, discovered after her death, reveal a mind beginning to grapple with doubts and fears that had no rational basis. September 12, 1898. Examined little Lily's portrait again today under the new magnifying lens. There are details in her expression that I somehow missed during all my previous examinations. How is it possible that a photograph I created contains nuances I do not remember capturing? September 19, 1898. Mrs. Patterson visited today with her daughter, hoping the child might benefit from exposure to Lily's joyful spirit. But when little Margaret saw the portrait, she began crying uncontrollably. She said Lily looked too happy and that nobody should smile like that. What could she mean by such a thing? September 26, 1898. I dreamed of Lily again last night. In the dream, her smile never changed, never faltered. Even when tears were streaming down her face, she tried to tell me something, but her mouth was frozen in that perfect expression of joy. I woke feeling more disturbed than comforted. Why would such a beautiful dream leave me so unsettled? The growing tension between the portrait's public acclaim and Mrs. Ashford's private torment was approaching a crisis point. The image that had brought joy to so many was becoming a source of increasing anguish for its creator. And as autumn approached, the weight of whatever secret Mrs. Ashford carried was becoming too great to bear alone. The stage was set for a revelation that would transform the most beloved photograph in New England into something far more sinister. The portrait that had brought happiness to hundreds was about to reveal a truth so disturbing that those who learned it would never again be able to look upon a child's smile without wondering what sorrows it might conceal. As October 1898 dawned crisp and clear, Mrs. Cordelia Ashford made a decision that would shatter the joyful world she had created with a single photograph. The time had come to tell the truth about little Lily, whose radiant smile had captured so many hearts. But she could never have anticipated that her honesty would unleash consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. The portrait that looked so joyful was about to reveal its terrible secret, and nothing in Havenport would ever be the same again. The moment that would forever change how people understood the nature of joy itself came on a grey October morning in 1898. Mrs. Penelope Whitmore arrived at Mrs. Ashford's studio for what she assumed would be a routine discussion about her annual Christmas card photograph, unaware that she was about to become the first person outside of Mrs. Ashford herself to learn the horrifying truth behind the most beloved portrait in New England. As autumn light filtered weakly through the studio's windows, Mrs. Whitmore found herself once again drawn to little Lily's portrait, which continued to hold its place of honor on the mantelpiece. For over a year, she had found comfort in the child's radiant smile, using it as a source of strength during her own times of trial. Today, however, something seemed different about both the image and the woman who had created it. Mrs. Ashford appeared haggard in a way that went beyond mere fatigue. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. her graying hair poorly arranged, her hands shaking as she attempted to organize the photographic plates scattered across her work table. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she had not slept well in weeks, and her conversation seemed distracted, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences during which her gaze would drift inevitably to little Lily's smiling face. "Mrs. Ashford," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, unable to ignore the photographer's obvious distress. "You seem quite unwell. Perhaps we should postpone our discussion until you're feeling better. You appear to be under considerable strain." "Strain," Mrs. Ashford repeated, her voice hollow. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, I am indeed under strain. The weight of carrying certain knowledge while watching others remain in blissful ignorance has become unbearable." Mrs. Whitmore felt a chill of unease at her words, but before she could respond, Mrs. Ashford rose from her chair and moved to stand directly beneath the portrait that had become both her greatest triumph and her torment. "You have often remarked upon little Lily's joy," Mrs. Ashford continued, her voice growing stronger as she prepared to unburden herself of her terrible secret. "You have called her an angel, a perfect example of childhood happiness. Others have said the same. For over a year, I have listened to such praise while carrying knowledge that grows heavier with each passing day." "Mrs. Ashford, you're frightening me," Mrs. Whitmore said, though even as she spoke, she found her eyes drawn once again to the joyful face in the portrait. Something about the photographer's manner was making her see the image differently, though she could not yet identify what had changed. "The child in this portrait is indeed named Lily," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily Margaret Dawson, 8 years old when this photograph was taken on May 15th, 1897. She was indeed joyful as she appears in the image, but there is something about the source of that joy, something about why she smiled so radiantly that I have never told anyone." Mrs. Whitmore waited, sensing that whatever was about to be revealed would fundamentally alter her understanding of the portrait she had so long admired. "Lily Dawson was brought to my studio by her parents on that May afternoon," Mrs. Ashford continued, her voice growing steadier as she began to unburden herself. "They were a respectable family. Mr. Dawson worked as a clerk in the railroad office. Mrs. Dawson took in sewing to supplement their modest income. They wanted a portrait of their daughter, they said, to capture her happiness before it was too late." "Too late?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be more disturbing than she was prepared to hear. Mrs. Ashford moved to her desk and withdrew a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with the meticulous records she kept of every photographic session. Lily Dawson had been diagnosed with a rare condition that affected her ability to feel physical pain, she read from her careful notes. "The medical term is congenital insensitivity to pain, a condition so uncommon that most physicians have never encountered it. At first, her parents had thought it a blessing. Their daughter never cried when she fell, never complained of the bumps and bruises that make other children miserable." Mrs. Whitmore felt her stomach begin to turn as the implications began to dawn on her. "But as Lily grew older," Mrs. Ashford continued, her voice growing more strained, "her parents began to understand the terrible nature of her condition. She could not feel the warning signals that protect the rest of us from harm. She would place her hands on hot stoves without flinching, walk on broken glass without noticing her injuries, bite through her own tongue during meals without realizing what she was doing." The joyful expression that Mrs. Whitmore had found so uplifting now took on a sinister new meaning. The radiant smile that had seemed to embody pure happiness was revealed as something far more disturbing. The expression of a child who literally could not feel the pain that would have taught her to be more cautious, more fearful, more aware of danger. "By the time her parents brought her to me," Mrs. Ashford read from her notes, "Lily had sustained numerous injuries that should have been agonizing, but which she experienced as merely curious sensations. Burns, cuts, broken bones. She had endured them all with that same radiant smile, interpreting these devastating injuries as interesting new experiences rather than sources of suffering." Mrs. Whitmore sank into her chair as the full horror of what she was learning began to sink in. The perfect joy she had admired was not the result of exceptional happiness, but of a neurological condition that prevented the child from experiencing one of the most fundamental human sensations, the pain that serves as our most basic protection against harm. "Her parents were desperate," Mrs. Ashford continued, her own voice now heavy with anguish. "They had consulted every physician in the region, but there was no treatment for Lily's condition. They lived in constant terror that their daughter would injure herself in some way that would be fatal before she could understand the danger she was in. They brought her to me because they wanted to preserve an image of her joy before. Before what? Mrs. Whitmore whispered, though she suspected she already knew. Before they were forced to make the most heartbreaking decision any parents could face. They had arranged for Lily to be committed to the Hartford Hospital for the Insane, where she would be kept in a padded cell for her own protection. It was the only way they could ensure her survival, even though it meant condemning their joyful child to a life of imprisonment. The revelation hit Mrs. Whitmore like a physical blow. The radiant happiness she had found so uplifting was actually the expression of a child who was about to be locked away from the world. Her joy preserved in this photograph as a final memory before her parents consigned her to a living death in the name of keeping her safe. That smile you have so admired, Mrs. Ashford said, gesturing toward the portrait, was captured during what may have been the last afternoon Lily ever spent in freedom. She was happy because she had no understanding of pain, no concept of danger, no awareness of the fate that awaited her. Her joy was perfect because it was born of perfect ignorance. Mrs. Whitmore stared at the portrait with new eyes, and what had once seemed like angelic happiness now appeared heartbreakingly tragic. The child's radiant smile became the expression of someone too innocent to understand her own doom, too neurologically damaged to feel the emotional pain that should have accompanied her physical suffering. "Why are you telling me this?" Mrs. Whitmore managed to ask. "Because I cannot bear the praise any longer," Mrs. Ashford replied, her voice breaking. For over a year, people have looked at that image and seen perfect childhood happiness. They have no idea they are admiring the photograph of a child whose joy came from a condition so terrible that it could only end in tragedy. Every compliment feels like a mockery of Lily's suffering and a reminder of how I have allowed others to find comfort in something so deeply disturbing. The revelation that began in Mrs. Ashford's studio that October morning did not remain contained, despite the photographer's desperate pleas for discretion. Mrs. Whitmore, shaken to her very core by what she had learned, found herself unable to keep the terrible secret. Within days, the truth about little Lily's condition and fate began to spread through Havenport's interconnected social circles like a poison. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Families who had hung copies of the portrait in their homes, who had found comfort in the child's joyous expression, who had used her image as a source of happiness during difficult times, suddenly found themselves confronted with the knowledge that they had been celebrating a form of neurological damage so severe it had required institutionalization. Mr. Jonathan Hartwell, who had displayed the portrait in his bank's lobby, removed it immediately upon learning the truth, but the damage to his peace of mind had already been done. "It is remarkable how completely context can transform perception," he wrote in a letter to a colleague. The same radiant smile that once welcomed customers now seems to mock the very concept of happiness. I find myself unable to look at the image without feeling a profound sense of horror and pity. The phenomenon was not limited to adults. Throughout Havenport, children who had grown accustomed to little Lily's smiling presence began reporting disturbing dreams. They spoke of a laughing child who never stopped smiling even while terrible things happened to her, who continued to radiate joy while blood streamed from wounds she could not feel. 8-year-old Timothy Patterson, who had often stopped to smile back at little Lily's portrait in the school hallway, began having nightmares about a girl who laughed while walking through fire, who giggled while cutting herself with knives, who maintained perfect happiness while her body was destroyed around her. His teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Fielding, reported that Timothy had become obsessed with testing his own pain response, pinching and scratching himself to make sure he could still feel discomfort. The local newspaper, the Havenport Chronicle, attempted to address the crisis with a carefully worded editorial titled "On the Nature of Human Suffering." The editor, Mr. Charles Worthington, wrote, "Recent revelations concerning a certain photographic portrait that has long been cherished by our community have caused considerable distress among our citizens. While we understand the shock that such knowledge must bring, we encourage our readers to remember that joy and sorrow are often more closely intertwined than we care to acknowledge. The child's happiness, even if born of unfortunate circumstances, was nonetheless genuine. But Worthington's attempts at philosophical comfort fell on deaf ears. The community's relationship with happiness itself had been fundamentally altered. People began to question the authenticity of their own joy, wondering if their moments of contentment might be masking unacknowledged suffering. Parents became hyper-vigilant about their children's expressions of happiness, fearing that too much joy might indicate something was wrong. The portrait had taught them that the most radiant smiles could conceal the most tragic circumstances, and this knowledge poisoned their ability to take comfort in simple pleasures. What had once seemed like innocent childhood joy was now revealed as the expression of a mind too damaged to understand its own peril. Local physicians found themselves fielding an unprecedented number of inquiries from parents convinced that their children might be suffering from the same condition as little Lily. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, who had once praised the portrait's depiction of pure joy, now found himself conducting painful consultations with families terrified that their children's happiness might be pathological. The tragic irony, he wrote in his medical journal, is that this single case has taught our community to fear the very emotion we should most cherish in our children. Parents who once celebrated their offspring's joy now scrutinize every smile for signs of neurological abnormality. We have learned to distrust happiness itself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ashford herself was experiencing the most severe psychological effects of her revelation. The guilt that had prompted her confession had not been relieved by sharing her secret. Instead, it had been compounded by witnessing the devastation her honesty had caused. She found herself spending hours each day staring at little Lily's portrait, as if searching for some sign of the tragedy that had been hidden within the child's radiant expression. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. Clients arrived for appointments to find the studio locked, with Mrs. Ashford nowhere to be found. When she was present, her work showed a marked decline in quality as her hands trembled too severely to operate her equipment with her former precision. The woman who had once been New England's most celebrated child photographer seemed to be disintegrating before the eyes of those who knew her. Her notebook entries from this period reveal a mind under tremendous strain. November 3rd, 1898. Mrs. Henderson brought her daughter for a portrait today. When the child smiled during our session, I found myself scrutinizing her expression for signs of the terrible innocence I captured in little Lily. How am I to photograph children's joy when I now know the horrors it might conceal? November 8th, 1898. Received a letter from Dr. Thornfield inquiring about Lily's current condition. I realized I have no idea what became of her after that May afternoon. Her parents never returned to collect the portrait. Have they forgotten their daughter entirely, or is her situation too painful for them to bear reminders? November 12th, 1898. I cannot stop staring at Lily's smile. I have begun to see things in her expression that I never noticed before, a kind of desperate quality beneath the joy, as if some part of her understood what was happening even if her damaged nerves could not transmit the appropriate warnings. Or perhaps I am simply projecting my own guilt onto her innocent face. The psychological deterioration of the portrait's creator became a source of additional distress for the community. People who had once sought out Mrs. Ashford's artistic services now crossed the street to avoid encountering her during her increasingly rare ventures outside her studio. The woman who had brought so much documented joy into their lives had become a living reminder of the terrible knowledge that now haunted them all. As November progressed, reports began to surface of strange behavior in children throughout Havenport. Teachers noted that students had become reluctant to express happiness in school, as if they feared their joy might be interpreted as evidence of some underlying pathology. Parents reported that their children had begun testing themselves obsessively, pinching their arms, touching hot objects, deliberately causing minor injuries to ensure they could still feel pain normally. The Havenport Elementary School, which had so proudly displayed little Lily's portrait in its main hallway, found itself dealing with an epidemic of what administrators termed inappropriate, pain-seeking behavior. Children were deliberately injuring themselves in small ways, not out of self-destructive impulses, but out of a desperate need to confirm that they were capable of normal suffering. Dr. Thornfield found himself treating numerous cases of what he termed inverse hypochondria, children and adults who had become convinced that their ability to experience joy indicated some form of neurological damage. Families who had once celebrated their children's sunny dispositions now lived in constant fear that happiness itself might be a symptom of disease. What we are witnessing, he wrote in his private notes, is the complete breakdown of our community's ability to trust in the authenticity of positive emotions. The revelation about little Lily's condition has taught us that joy can mask the most terrible suffering, and this knowledge has poisoned our ability to take comfort in our own happiness. We have learned to fear the very emotion that makes life worth living. But the most disturbing development was the fate of little Lily herself. Mrs. Ashford's attempts to contact the Dawson family and inquire about their daughter's well-being had been met with silence. The modest house on Maple Street where the family had lived stood empty, with neighbors reporting that the Dawsons had departed Havenport abruptly sometime during the summer of 1897, leaving no forwarding address. Records from the Hartford Hospital for the Insane showed no admission for a Lily Dawson during the relevant time period. Inquiries to other institutions throughout New England yielded similar results. It was as if little Lily and her family had simply vanished, leaving behind only the photograph that had brought so much joy and was now causing so much anguish. As 1898 drew to its close, the situation in Havenport had reached a crisis point. The revelation of a single child's tragic condition had triggered a community-wide crisis of faith in the reliability of human happiness. People who had once found comfort in simple pleasures now lived in constant doubt about the authenticity of their own emotions. The portrait that had brought joy to so many had become the source of their deepest fears about the nature of happiness itself. Little Lily's radiant smile, once a symbol of perfect childhood bliss, now served as a reminder that the most beautiful expressions of joy might conceal the most heartbreaking circumstances. And at the center of it all sat Mrs. Cordelia Ashford in her studio, staring at the image that had made her famous and was now destroying her sanity. The joyful portrait that hung on her mantelpiece continued to smile its eternal smile, but now she could see in that expression all the tragedy and horror that lay beneath its radiant surface. The terrible truth she had finally shared had not brought her the relief she had expected. Instead, it had opened a door to questions and fears that threatened to consume not just her own peace of mind, but the happiness of everyone who had ever found comfort in little Lily's impossible joy. 3 months had passed since Mrs. Ashford's devastating revelation about little Lily's condition, and the town of Havenport had settled into an uneasy state that resembled normalcy, but felt more like a collective holding of breath. The initial shock of learning that their beloved portrait depicted a child whose joy stemmed from neurological damage had given way to a deeper, more pervasive anxiety that seemed to infect every aspect of daily life. But for Mrs. Ashford herself, the nightmare was only deepening. The terrible truth she had shared about Lily's condition had not brought her the peace she had desperately sought. Instead, it had awakened new questions, darker possibilities, and a growing obsession with discovering what had actually become of the joyful child whose image had captivated so many hearts. It was on a frigid January morning in 1899, as snow fell silently outside the frost-covered windows of her studio, that Mrs. Ashford made the decision that would lead to the discovery of truths far more horrifying than anything she had yet revealed. Armed with Lily's portrait and what few records she had of the Dawson family, she set out to trace the fate of the child whose smile had brought joy to hundreds while concealing a tragedy that was only beginning to reveal its true dimensions. Her first stop was the Hartford Hospital for the Insane, the institution where Lily's parents had supposedly planned to commit their daughter. Dr. Reginald Forsyth, the hospital's chief administrator, received Mrs. Ashford in his austere office with the weary courtesy of a man accustomed to difficult inquiries about former patients. "I have reviewed our admission records extensively," Dr. Forsyth told her, consulting a thick, leather-bound ledger. "We have no record of admitting a child named Lily Dawson during 1897 or any subsequent year. Given the rarity of the condition you describe, such a case would certainly have been noted in our files. I can only conclude that the family made alternative arrangements for their daughter's care." But Mrs. Ashford's inquiries at other institutions throughout New England yielded similar results. The Connecticut State Hospital, the Massachusetts General Hospital, even private sanitariums that specialized in unusual medical conditions, none had any record of treating a child matching Lily's description. It was as if little Lily Dawson had simply vanished from the medical system entirely. Her investigation took on a more personal dimension when she returned to Havenport and attempted to track down the Dawson family's former neighbors and acquaintances. What she discovered was far more disturbing than simple absence of records. It was the complete absence of any reliable memory of the family's existence. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, who had lived next door to the house on Maple Street where the Dawsons supposedly resided, stared at Mrs. Ashford with genuine confusion when shown Lily's portrait. "I'm terribly sorry, my dear, but I have no recollection of any family by that name living in that house," she said, studying the photograph carefully. During 1897, that property was occupied by the Weatherbys, an elderly couple with no children. They lived there for nearly a decade before moving to live with their son in Boston. Similar conversations with other supposed neighbors yielded equally puzzling results. The local postmaster had no record of mail being delivered to a Dawson family. The parish records of all three churches in Havenport contain no mention of a family by that name. Even the railroad office, where Mr. Dawson had supposedly worked as a clerk, had no employment records matching his description. Mrs. Ashford's notebook entries from this period reveal a mind grappling with discoveries that challenged everything she thought she knew about the portrait's origins. February 8, 1899. Spoke with Mr. Harrison at the railroad office today. He has been employed there for 15 years and maintains meticulous records of all personnel. No one named Dawson has ever worked in his department. He suggested I might be confusing the name, but I'm certain of what the family told me when they brought Lily for her portrait. February 12, 1899. Visited the cemetery today to search for any grave markers bearing the Dawson name. The groundskeeper, Mr. Mills, has maintained detailed burial records for over 20 years. He found no record of any burials for a family named Dawson, nor any child named Lily during the relevant time period. I'm beginning to question my own sanity. February 18, 1899. Examined my original session notes again under a magnifying glass. The handwriting is definitely mine, but some of the details seem strange. I recorded that the family paid me in advance, but I can find no corresponding entry in my financial ledgers. How did I overlook such a discrepancy for so long? The more Mrs. Ashford investigated, the more the evidence pointed to an impossible conclusion. The Dawson family had never existed at all, yet the portrait of little Lily remained, hanging in its place of honor on her mantelpiece, smiling its eternal smile as if mocking her attempts to uncover the truth of its origins. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Prout Ashford decided to examine the original glass plate negative under the most powerful magnification equipment she could acquire. What she discovered there would challenge not only her understanding of the portrait's origins, but her grasp on reality itself. Under extreme magnification, details became visible that had been invisible to the naked eye during her original examination of the negative. The intricate lacework on Lily's dress revealed patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. The porcelain doll clutched in the child's arms displayed facial features that appeared subtly different from what was visible in the prints, expressions that seemed almost aware, almost knowing, but most disturbing of all were the background details that should not have been there. Mrs. Ashford's studio was a simple, well-lit space with plain white walls and minimal furnishings. Yet under magnification, the negative revealed shadowy shapes in the background, indistinct forms that suggested the presence of other figures during the photographic session. Mrs. Ashford's hands began to tremble as she studied these anomalous details. She had been alone with little Lily during the portrait session, or at least that was what she remembered. Her standard practice was to work privately with child subjects, finding that they were less self-conscious and more natural when not observed by their parents. Yet the evidence of the negative suggested that others had been present, watching from the shadows. Her notebook entries became increasingly frantic as she documented these discoveries. March 2nd, 1899. The background figures are definitely present in the original negative. They appear to be adults, tall, thin shapes that seem to be observing the session with great interest. How could I have failed to notice their presence during the actual photography? Am I losing my mind, or is there some explanation for these impossibilities? March 8th, 1899. I have been examining other negatives from the same time period to see if similar anomalies are present. In several other child portraits taken during the spring and summer of 1897, I can detect similar shadowy figures in the backgrounds, always watching, always observing, as if the children's joy was somehow drawing their attention. March 15th, 1899. I attempted to create enlarged prints of the background figures, hoping to make out their features more clearly. The results are deeply disturbing. The shapes appear to be human, but there is something wrong with their proportions. They seem too tall, too thin, as if they are stretched or elongated in ways that human anatomy should not permit. As Mrs. Ashford's investigation deepened, she began to experience phenomena that defied rational explanation. While working late in her studio, she would sometimes glimpse movement in her peripheral vision, tall, thin shapes that seemed to retreat into the shadows when she turned to look directly at them. The scent of something sweet and cloying would occasionally fill the studio, reminiscent of flowers left too long in a closed room. Most unsettling of all were the changes she began to notice in little Lily's portrait itself. The child's expression, which had remained constant for nearly 2 years, seemed to be subtly shifting. Where once her smile had appeared purely joyful, Mrs. Ashford now detected what seemed like a pleading quality, as if the child were trying to communicate some urgent message through her frozen expression. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, concerned about Mrs. Ashford's increasingly erratic behavior, visited her studio several times during this period. His notes provide valuable insight into the photographer's deteriorating mental state. Mrs. Ashford has become obsessed with discovering the truth about the child in her famous portrait, but her investigations have led her to conclusions that strain credibility. She insists that the family who commissioned the portrait never existed, despite having detailed records of their session. She claims to see figures in her photographs that are invisible to others and speaks of the portrait changing before her eyes. While I sympathize with her distress over the revelation of the child's tragic condition, I fear her guilt has triggered a complete psychological breakdown. But Dr. Thornfield's rational assessment was challenged when Mrs. Ashford showed him her discoveries under magnification. Even the skeptical physician had to admit that there appeared to be something unusual about the negative's background details. While I remain convinced that there is a rational explanation for these apparent anomalies, he wrote privately, I cannot deny that Mrs. Ashford's photographic negative displays characteristics that are difficult to explain through conventional means. The shapes she believes to be figures could be photographic artifacts, chemical stains, or optical illusions created by the magnification process. Yet their consistency and apparent organization suggest a pattern that mere chance would be unlikely to produce. As March progressed into April, Mrs. Ashford made a discovery that would prove to be the most disturbing yet. While searching through old newspaper archives at the Havenport Historical Society, hoping to find any mention of the Dawson family, she instead found something that challenged her understanding of time itself. In a newspaper dated June 3rd, 1895, nearly 2 years before she claimed to have photographed little Lily, there was a small advertisement in the classified section. Child's portrait available. Exceptional quality photograph of joyful young girl suitable for display in homes or businesses seeking to create cheerful atmosphere. Inquire at Ashford Photography Studio, Elm Street. The date was impossible. Mrs. Ashford distinctly remembered taking Lily's portrait in May of 1897, yet here was evidence that she had been advertising the image for sale 2 years earlier. Her meticulous studio records showed no session scheduled for May 15, 1895. Indeed, she had been traveling to Boston that entire week to attend a photography exhibition. Frantically searching through earlier newspaper issues, Mrs. Ashford found additional advertisements for the portrait dating back even further. The earliest she could locate was from December 1893, over 3 years before she had supposedly first encountered little Lily. Her final notebook entry before her complete breakdown was found by Dr. Thornfield, scrawled in handwriting so shaky as to be barely legible. March 30th, 1899. I understand now that I have never been in control of this situation. The portrait exists outside of time, outside of normal causality. Little Lily was never a real child. She is something else, something that uses the appearance of innocent joy to draw attention and admiration. The shadowy figures in the background are not observers. They are the ones who created her, who placed her image in my studio to serve purposes I cannot comprehend. I have been nothing more than their instrument, their means of distributing her influence throughout New England. Every print I have made, every family that has hung her portrait in their home, has been part of some larger design. But what do they want? What is the purpose of spreading this false joy? This manufactured happiness that conceals such dark intentions? The child is not real, but her influence is. I can see it now in the eyes of the children who have gazed upon her portrait. A subtle change, a gradual transformation that I was too blind to notice before. They are learning to smile as she smiles, to radiate the same impossible joy that comes from some source other than genuine human emotion. God help me, I have been complicit in something monstrous. But it may already be too late to stop what has been set in motion. Mrs. Ashford was found the next morning, collapsed at her desk in a state of complete catatonia. Dr. Thornfield's initial examination revealed no obvious physical cause for her condition. She appeared to be in a state of profound psychological shock, as if her mind had simply shut down rather than process whatever final revelation she had experienced. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery made by Mrs. Whitmore when she arrived at the studio to check on her friend. Little Lily's portrait, which had hung above Mrs. Ashford's desk for nearly 2 years, was gone. In its place was an empty frame, with no trace of the glass plate or photographic print that had captivated so many viewers. A thorough search of the studio revealed no sign of the original negative or any of the prints Mrs. Ashford had been creating during her investigation. It was as if the portrait had simply vanished, taking with it all evidence of its existence, except for the hundreds of copies that had been distributed throughout New England, copies that families were now frantically trying to locate and destroy. But the disappearance of the original portrait did not end the mystery, it only deepened it. Reports began filtering in from across the region of families discovering that their copies of Little Lily's portrait had undergone subtle changes. The child's smile, which had remained constant for so long, was now described by viewers as seeming less innocent, more knowing, or even slightly sinister. Children who had grown up under Lily's smiling gaze began exhibiting behavioral changes that alarmed their parents and teachers. They would maintain expressions of joy even during inappropriate moments, continuing to smile radiantly while being scolded, while witnessing accidents, even while experiencing physical pain themselves. It was as if they had learned from Lily's example that happiness was a mask to be worn regardless of circumstances. Dr. Thornfield found himself treating an unprecedented number of cases involving children who seemed to have developed an inability to express negative emotions naturally. They would force themselves to smile during times when tears would be appropriate, laugh at things that should have frightened them, and maintain artificial cheer that seemed to require enormous effort to sustain. What we appear to be witnessing, he wrote in his confidential notes, is a form of emotional contagion, unlike anything documented in medical literature. These children seem to have internalized the portrait's depiction of persistent joy as a behavioral ideal, forcing themselves to maintain happiness even when such expressions are psychologically inappropriate or emotionally unhealthy. But the most disturbing development was the discovery that the phenomenon was spreading beyond families who had owned copies of the portrait. Children throughout New England, even those who had never been directly exposed to Little Lily's image, began displaying similar patterns of forced happiness and emotional suppression. It was as if the portrait's influence had taken on a life of its own, spreading from child to child through some mechanism that transcended physical presence. Teachers reported students who seemed to be unconsciously mimicking Lily's expression, maintaining the same radiant smile while their eyes remained strangely empty and distant. As spring gave way to summer, the scope of the crisis became clear. What had begun as a beloved portrait in a single photographer's studio had somehow evolved into a regional epidemic of artificial joy that was affecting thousands of children. The influence that Mrs. Ashford had unknowingly unleashed was no longer contained by the physical limits of photographic prints. It had become something autonomous, something that could reproduce and spread itself through means that defied understanding. At the center of it all lay Mrs. Ashford in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with unseeing eyes, her mind apparently shattered by whatever final truth she had discovered about the nature of Little Lily and the forces that had used her studio to spread their influence throughout New England. The portrait that had looked so joyful was revealing its true nature as something far more insidious, not merely a deceptive image, but the seed of a psychological contagion that was transforming the very nature of childhood happiness throughout the region. And as summer approached its peak, those few who understood the scope of the crisis began to realize that the disappearance of the original portrait might not represent the end of their troubles, but the beginning of something far worse. The summer of 1899 brought to New England a crisis unlike anything in the region's recorded history. What had begun as admiration for a single joyful portrait had evolved into a widespread epidemic of psychological transformation that threatened the very nature of childhood across multiple states. Mrs. Ashford lay catatonic in Hartford Hospital, her mind shattered by revelations too terrible to process, while the influence she had unknowingly unleashed continued to spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. Dr. Marcus Thornfield found himself at the center of what medical authorities were beginning to recognize as an unprecedented public health emergency. Children throughout New England were displaying symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding, a form of enforced happiness so complete and pervasive that it appeared to be overriding their natural emotional responses to trauma, pain, and appropriate social cues. The phenomenon had evolved far beyond the children who had been directly exposed to Little Lily's portrait. Reports were flooding in from schools, churches, and family physicians across Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Rhode Island describing children who maintained radiant smiles regardless of circumstances, who laughed inappropriately at tragedy, and who seemed incapable of expressing normal negative emotions even when such responses would be psychologically healthy. Dr. Thornfield's clinical observations, documented in what would later become one of the most important psychological case studies of the Victorian era, revealed the terrifying scope of the transformation. The affected children appear to have internalized an idealized model of constant joy that overrides their natural emotional responses. They smile while being disciplined, laugh while witnessing accidents, and maintain expressions of happiness even when experiencing physical pain or emotional distress. Most disturbing of all, they seem to be actively teaching this behavior to other children, as if they have become missionaries of this artificial form of joy. The pattern of spread defied conventional understanding of how psychological conditions are transmitted. Children who had never seen little Lily's portrait, whose families had no connection to those who had displayed it, were nevertheless developing identical symptoms. It was as if the very concept of Lily's impossible happiness had taken on a life of its own, spreading from mind to mind through mechanisms that psychology had not yet discovered. Mrs. Penelope Whitmore, who had been the first to learn the truth about Lily's condition, found herself serving as an unofficial coordinator of the crisis response. Her own children had been among the first affected, and her desperate attempts to understand what was happening to them had made her one of the few adults who fully grasped the supernatural dimensions of what they were confronting. It began with my youngest, Margaret, she wrote in her detailed account of the epidemic. She had always been a serious child, given to quiet contemplation and occasional melancholy. But after months of exposure to Lily's portrait, she began to smile constantly, not the natural smile of a happy child, but a fixed, artificial expression that never varied regardless of her circumstances. When I asked her to stop, she would tell me that happy children are good children and that she was learning to be as joyful as the picture girl. The transformation was not limited to facial expressions. Affected children began to exhibit behavioral changes that were both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. They would continue playing and laughing while injured, maintaining their cheerful demeanor even when such responses were clearly inappropriate. They seemed to have lost the ability to use negative emotions as normal warning systems, putting themselves in danger because they could no longer properly assess threats or respond to pain. School officials throughout the region found themselves dealing with classrooms full of children who maintained identical expressions of artificial joy while their academic performance deteriorated, and their social development became increasingly abnormal. Teachers reported that affected students would continue smiling radiantly while failing examinations, being excluded from games by their peers, or even while being physically bullied by other children. Miss Dorothy Fielding, a veteran teacher at Havenport Elementary School, described the transformation of her classroom in terms that bordered on the apocalyptic. By June of 1899, nearly half of my students displayed the same unnaturally constant smile that we had learned to associate with exposure to the portrait. They would sit in perfect rows, their faces radiant with identical expressions of joy, while their eyes remained strangely vacant and distant. It was as if they had been replaced by artificial versions of themselves, versions that knew only how to express happiness but had lost access to the full range of human emotion that makes children truly alive. The crisis deepened when medical authorities began to recognize that the affected children were not simply mimicking Lily's expression. They were actively recruiting other children to join them in their state of artificial joy. They would approach unaffected peers with missionary zeal, explaining that happiness was a choice and that choosing to be constantly joyful was both morally superior and socially desirable. Dr. Thornfield documented numerous cases of children who reported being visited in their dreams by little Lily herself, who would teach them songs about happiness and show them how to maintain perfect joy regardless of circumstances. These dream encounters followed remarkably consistent patterns, suggesting that something beyond normal psychological suggestion was at work. The children described meeting a little girl with golden curls who teaches them that sadness, fear, and anger are ugly feelings that good children must learn to hide, he wrote. She shows them how to smile so brightly that the bad feelings go away, how to laugh so loudly that they can't hear anything else, how to be so happy that nothing else matters. When they wake, they maintain the expressions and behaviors she taught them, as if they have been programmed during their sleep. The situation reached its crisis point in late July when a group of affected children in Salem, Massachusetts, were found gathered in an abandoned warehouse, standing in perfect formation while maintaining their identical radiant smiles. They had been missing for 3 days, but claimed they had only been there for a few hours, learning new songs from the picture girl who visited them in their special place. When authorities attempted to separate the children and return them to their families, they displayed their first negative emotion since becoming affected. Not sadness or fear, but a form of desperate panic at being taken away from each other. It became clear that the transformation had created not just artificial happiness, but a form of collective identity that transcended individual family bonds. Mrs. Whitmore, working with Dr. Thornfield and a growing network of concerned parents and medical professionals, began to piece together the true scope of what they were confronting. The investigation that Mrs. Ashford had begun before her breakdown had revealed that little Lily's portrait existed outside normal temporal boundaries, appearing in newspaper advertisements years before it had supposedly been created, distributed to families who had no memory of purchasing it, created by a photographer who had no record of the session. We are dealing with something that used Mrs. Ashford's studio and reputation as a means to distribute its influence throughout our region, Mrs. Whitmore wrote in her correspondence with medical authorities in Boston and New York. The portrait was never a simple photograph. It was a kind of psychic infection designed to transform our children into something other than human. The artificial joy they display is not happiness in any recognizable sense, but a form of emotional paralysis that makes them susceptible to outside control. The breakthrough came when Dr. Thornfield made a disturbing discovery while examining Mrs. Ashford in her catatonic state. Though she appeared completely unresponsive to external stimuli, careful observation revealed that her facial muscles would occasionally twitch into the beginnings of a smile, the same radiant expression that had captivated viewers of little Lily's portrait. Using experimental techniques borrowed from European researchers studying hypnosis and suggestion, Dr. Thornfield was able to establish limited communication with Mrs. Ashford's subconscious mind. What he learned from these sessions challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of consciousness and reality. Mrs. Ashford's mind has not been destroyed, he wrote in his confidential notes. It has been imprisoned within her own body, while something else uses her knowledge and memories to coordinate the spread of the condition. She is aware of what is happening, but powerless to prevent it. Through her, the entities that created little Lily's portrait are directing the transformation of our children into something that will serve their purposes. The revelation that Mrs. Ashford's breakdown had been not a psychological collapse, but a form of supernatural possession galvanized the desperate parents and medical professionals who were fighting to save their children. If the photographer could be freed from whatever held her captive, she might be able to provide the information needed to break the spell that had transformed so many young minds. Working with Father Michael O'Sullivan, a Catholic priest who had experience with cases of alleged demonic influence, Dr. Thornfield attempted what amounted to a medical exorcism of Mrs. Ashford's condition. The procedure, conducted in complete secrecy in a private room at Hartford Hospital, would prove to be the most harrowing experience of the doctor's career. As we began the ritual cleansing Father O'Sullivan had prescribed, Dr. Thornfield wrote, Mrs. Ashford's body began to convulse with incredible violence. But most disturbing of all was her face, which cycled through dozens of different expressions, sometimes her own terrified features, sometimes the radiant smile of little Lily, and sometimes expressions that belonged to no human face I had ever seen. It was as if multiple entities were fighting for control of her physical form. The battle for Mrs. Ashford's consciousness lasted nearly 6 hours. During the procedure, she spoke in voices that were not her own, revealing details about the true nature of little Lily and the forces that had created her. The portrait, they learned, was not simply a photograph, but a carefully crafted doorway between dimensions, a means for entities that existed in spaces between reality to influence and eventually harvest human consciousness. They feed on joy, Mrs. Ashford whispered during one brief moment, when her own personality resurged. Not genuine happiness, but artificial joy that has been separated from its natural context. They use the children's forced smiles as a form of energy, and when enough of them are transformed, they will be able to cross over completely into our world. The children are not just infected, they are being prepared as vessels for occupation. The revelation that the affected children were being prepared for supernatural possession by entities from another dimension transformed the crisis from a medical emergency into what amounted to a war for the souls of New England's youth. Dr. Thornfield and his allies realized they were facing an enemy that operated beyond the boundaries of normal physical reality, something that could influence human consciousness directly and use that influence to reshape reality according to its own purposes. Working frantically against time, they developed a treatment protocol that combined medical intervention with spiritual cleansing. The process required isolating affected children from each other to break the collective reinforcement of their artificial joy, then using a combination of therapeutic techniques and religious rituals to help them reconnect with their natural emotional responses. The treatment was dangerous and not always successful. Some children, particularly those who had been affected longest, seemed to have lost the ability to experience genuine emotions at all. When their artificial joy was removed, they were left in a state of emotional numbness that no conventional therapy could address. But for many others, the intervention proved effective. As the forced smiles faded and natural expressions returned, the children would break down in tears as they processed the trauma of having been emotionally imprisoned for months. Parents wept with relief as their sons and daughters displayed anger, sadness, and fear, emotions they had thought were lost forever. The process of healing was slow and incomplete. Even children who recovered their emotional range would sometimes lapse back into Lily's radiant smile during moments of stress. As if the artificial joy remained as a defense mechanism they could retreat into when reality became too difficult to bear. Mrs. Ashford herself recovered gradually over the course of several months, though she retained no clear memory of her possession or the revelations that had come through her during the exorcism. She would spend the rest of her life as a changed woman, never again practicing photography and never able to look upon images of children without visible distress. The official records of the crisis were carefully suppressed by medical and governmental authorities who feared that public knowledge of the supernatural dimensions would cause widespread panic. The epidemic was eventually attributed to a form of mass hysteria, triggered by economic anxiety and rapid social changes, with the affected children receiving treatment for nervous exhaustion and overstimulation of the emotional faculties. But those who lived through the crisis knew the truth. Little Lily's portrait had been something far more dangerous than a simple photograph. It had been a weapon designed to transform human consciousness and prepare the way for an invasion that had only been narrowly averted. The joyful image that had brought so much happiness to so many homes had concealed a plan to harvest the souls of children and use their bodies as vessels for entities that had no business in the human world. In the years that followed, Dr. Thornfield continued his research into what he privately termed psychic contagion, the process by which artificial emotions and states of consciousness could be transmitted from person to person through mechanisms that conventional psychology could not explain. His work would eventually contribute to the development of modern understanding of mass psychological phenomena, though the supernatural dimensions of his research were never published. Mrs. Whitmore became an advocate for children who had suffered similar forms of psychological manipulation, working to establish support networks for families affected by what she called emotional counterfeiting. Her efforts led to the creation of several charitable organizations dedicated to helping children recover their natural emotional responses after exposure to artificial influences. The site of Mrs. Ashford's former studio was eventually demolished and replaced with a small park, though visitors sometimes reported feeling an inexplicable urge to smile when walking through the area. Local children were discouraged from playing there, and parents noted that their offspring seemed to avoid the location instinctively. The copies of little Lily's portrait that had been distributed throughout New England were systematically tracked down and destroyed by the network of families and medical professionals who understood their true nature. Most families surrendered their copies willingly once they learned of the connection to their children's transformation, though a few required more forceful intervention. The last known copy was discovered in 1923 in the attic of a house in Portland, Maine, where it had apparently been forgotten for decades. When local authorities attempted to destroy it, they found that the image seemed to resist conventional methods of disposal. Fire would not consume it, acid would not dissolve it, and physical attempts to tear or cut the photograph were unsuccessful. Finally, Father O'Sullivan, now elderly but still vigorous in his battle against supernatural influences, performed a special blessing over the image before it was sealed in a lead-lined box and buried in consecrated ground. The location of this burial was never recorded, and Father O'Sullivan took the secret with him to his grave. Today, more than a century after little Lily's portrait first appeared in Mrs. Ashford's studio, the story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of artificial emotion and the manipulation of human consciousness. Child psychologists and educators continue to study the case as an example of how manufactured happiness can be used to exploit and control young minds. The children who survived the epidemic grew up to become adults who understood the importance of authentic emotional expression and the dangers of forced positivity. Many became advocates for children's mental health, working to ensure that future generations would be protected from similar forms of psychological manipulation. Some of the survivors retained subtle after effects of their experience for their entire lives. They would occasionally display flashes of Lily's radiant smile during moments of extreme stress, as if some part of the artificial joy remained embedded in their consciousness. But rather than viewing this as a curse, many came to see it as a reminder of the importance of protecting genuine human emotion from those who would exploit it for their own purposes. The story of little Lily's portrait ultimately stands as a testament to the power of human resilience and the importance of community action in the face of supernatural threats. It demonstrates that even the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation can be overcome when people work together with courage, determination, and a commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder that true joy cannot be manufactured or imposed. It must emerge naturally from the full spectrum of human emotional experience, including the sadness, fear, and anger that the entities behind little Lily's portrait had sought to suppress. The children who learned to smile authentically again after their ordeal understood something that many adults never learn: that genuine happiness is precious precisely because it exists in balance with other emotions, not in isolation from them. The portrait that looked so joyful revealed itself to be a prison of artificial emotion, and its destruction became a liberation that allowed the children of New England to rediscover the authentic joy that comes from being fully, completely, and naturally human.